In 2010, 19-year-old Sam Ballard, an avid rugby player, was drinking red wine with his Australian mates when they saw a slug crawling across this concrete patio at his home in Sydney. After a silly dare, Sam picks up the slimy bugger, swallowing it whole. He had no idea that lurking inside that slug was a nasty parasite called Angiostronjilus cantonensis, more commonly known as rat lungworm. Next thing he knew, he's feeling weak and he has intense pain in his legs. His mom was suspicious that his symptoms were multiple sclerosis, but after he revealed that he ate a slug, doctors figure out that it was rat lungworm disease, or medically speaking, Angiostronjilus infection, a disease that occurs across the globe. This disease often progresses to something called eosinophilic meningitis, meaning the membranes that cover the brain become severely inflamed. So, how does a parasite that normally resides in the lungs of rats end up causing a serious case of meningitis to the point that he was in a coma for 420 days? To understand how this parasite can do this in a human, we'll have to take a look at its life cycle. An infected rat coughs up worms from the lungs into the throat, where they're then swallowed by the rat. The worms make their way down the rat's digestive tract and eventually end up in the rat's poop. Then comes along a slug or a snail and eats the rat's poop. So now that slug is infected, and when a rat eats an infected slug or snail, the cycle begins again. People get rat lungworm disease when they eat raw or undercooked slugs or snails that have worms in them. But the most common way people get this infection is when slugs and snails are on fruits or vegetables, if they're accidentally eaten, if they haven't been thoroughly washed. Another way this can happen is if freshwater crabs, shrimp, prawns, or frogs eat infected slugs or snails and are subsequently eaten by people, which is why these things should never be eaten raw or undercooked. Unlike in rats, the worm's life cycle is not completed in a human being. So instead of passing through the gut, the worm larvae actually end up getting lost, so to speak, and end up going from the gut to the brain, and there they cause an intense inflammatory reaction, especially as the larvae die off. Signs and symptoms are diverse, varying from patient to patient over days to weeks. As the worms migrate from the gut after they've been eaten, there can be abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and fever. There can also be a rash within hours to days. But the worst comes once they reach the brain. We're talking pain throughout the body, including severe headaches, numbness, tingling, nausea, vomiting, stiff neck, and even coma. Doing a brain MRI will likely show abnormal enhancing lesions, but the key to clinching the diagnosis is to do a lumbar puncture in order to detect eosinophils, which are a type of white blood cell, in the CSF, meaning the cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that circulates in the brain and spinal cord. In some instances, you can actually see the worms in the CSF. There are anti-helminthic drugs like albendazole that kill the migrating worms. But is that necessarily a good thing? This has been somewhat controversial in the past, as some experts believed that rapidly killing all the worms might produce extreme collateral damage from the intense inflammatory reaction that ensues. But most experts today have come to the consensus that it's best to give these drugs as soon as possible before the parasites grow. Early treatment with albendazole, ideally within 2 weeks of the infection, seems to be the best treatment, along with giving corticosteroids to try to suppress the inflammatory response. This is a tricky diagnosis for doctors to recognize, but it's essential to diagnose it quickly, especially as cases are rising in Australia and Hawaii. When Sam eventually woke up from his coma, he was never back to his previous health. He had permanent paralysis, he had a tracheostomy, a feeding tube in his stomach, a urinary catheter because he couldn't go to the bathroom on his own. And sadly, he passed away in 2018, just 8 years after eating the slug.